The Galactic Military Academy's lecture hall buzzed with nervous energy as over 300 cadets from dozens of species settled into their seats. Commander Zethkar, a towering Vorthak with 6 arms and crystalline skin that reflected the overhead lights, stood at the podium reviewing his notes for what would become the most memorable tactical analysis class in the Academy's history. The topic for today's discussion was supposed to be routine, comparative elimination rates across different military units in recent conflicts. Zethkar had prepared standard data from the Centauri border wars, the Rigel uprising, and the infamous siege of Kepler Station. What he hadn't expected was the question that would come from the back row. "Sir," called out Cadet Velnara, a young Ashari whose blue-scaled face showed genuine curiosity. "We've covered elimination rates for Kree shock troops, Draconian heavy infantry, even the legendary Altarian commandos. But what about Earth Marines? What's their elimination rate?" The question hung in the air like a charged particle waiting to discharge. Several cadets turned to look at Velnara, then back at their instructor. Earth was still relatively new to the Galactic Council, having joined only 15 standard years ago. Most species knew humans existed, but few had studied their military capabilities in detail. Commander Zethkar's 4 eyes blinked in sequence, a nervous habit he'd developed over his centuries of teaching. In all his years of military analysis, he had carefully avoided discussing human combat effectiveness. There were reasons for this avoidance. Reasons that made even a decorated veteran like himself uncomfortable. Zethkar paused, his massive frame shifting as he accessed his datapad. "That's an interesting question, Cadet. Perhaps we should move on to the next topic." But Velnara wasn't easily deterred. Her species, the Ashari, were known for their persistent nature and analytical minds. "With respect, sir, if we're conducting a comprehensive study of military effectiveness, shouldn't we include all council members? I mean, humans have been involved in 17 major conflicts since joining the council. Surely there's data available." Murmurs rippled through the lecture hall. Other cadets began to lean forward, their interest piqued. Cadet Threx, a massive Gordanian, whose rocky exterior made scraping sounds when he moved, raised one of his boulder-like appendages. "I've heard stories about human soldiers, sir. My cousin served alongside them during the Proxima incident. He said they were unusual." Zethkar's crystalline skin began to shift color slightly, a sign of distress among his people. He had hoped to avoid this conversation entirely. The truth about human Marines wasn't classified, exactly, but it was the kind of information that tended to make other species deeply uncomfortable. "Very well," Zethkar said finally, his voice carrying a weight that made several cadets sit up straighter. "But I want you to understand something before we begin. Military effectiveness isn't just about numbers. Context matters. Environment matters. Motivation matters." He activated the holographic display system, and the center of the lecture hall filled with swirling data points and tactical readouts. With a gesture, he called up the standard elimination rate chart that had been the focus of their studies for the past week. "As we've discussed," Zethkar continued, "elimination rates are typically measured as the number of enemy combatants neutralized per soldier per engagement. The Kree averaged 2.3 eliminations per soldier per engagement. Impressive, considering their brutal training regimens. The Draconians manage 3.1, which reflects their superior technology and tactical coordination. The Altarian commandos, who many consider the elite of the elite, achieve an average of 4.7 eliminations per soldier per engagement." The data hung in the air. Familiar numbers that the cadets had memorized and analyzed extensively. These were the benchmarks against which all military forces were measured. Any unit that could achieve rates approaching these numbers was considered exceptionally effective. Velnara raised her hand again. "And the humans, sir?" Zethkar's pause stretched longer this time. Around the lecture hall, cadets began to shift uncomfortably. Even those species known for their patience could sense something significant was about to be revealed. "Before I show you the data," Zethkar said slowly, "I need you to understand the context. Humans don't just fight differently than us. They think differently. Their entire approach to warfare is based on concepts that most of our species find disturbing." Cadet Mrix, A delicate Pixian whose butterfly-like wings fluttered nervously, spoke up in her tiny, melodic voice. "What kind of concepts, sir?" Zethkar accessed another file on his datapad, and suddenly the holographic display showed tactical footage from various human conflicts. The images were grainy and taken from orbital surveillance, but they clearly showed human soldiers in action during the Battle of Titan's Edge. "Humans have a concept they call acceptable losses," Zethkar explained. "Most species, when faced with a fortified position, will calculate the optimal approach to minimize casualties while achieving their objective. Humans calculate something different. They calculate how many of them can die while still accomplishing the mission, and then they proceed accordingly." The footage showed human Marines advancing across an open field under heavy fire. Several figures fell, but the rest continued forward without hesitation. When they reached the enemy fortifications, the fighting became so intense that the orbital cameras could barely track the movement. "This is from the Titan's Edge campaign," Zethkar continued. Human forces were tasked with taking a heavily fortified hegemony position. Every tactical analysis suggested it would require at least 3 full battalions and result in 60% casualties. The humans sent in 2 companies. Cadet Threx's rocky features shifted into what might have been a frown. 2 companies against a position that required 3 battalions? That's suicide. That's what every species thought, Zethkar agreed. The hegemony certainly thought so. They had prepared for a prolonged siege, with overlapping fields of fire, multiple defensive layers, and enough supplies to withstand a months-long assault. The holographic display zoomed in on the human advance. Even through the grainy footage, it was possible to see individual Marines moving with a fluid precision that seemed almost choreographed. They moved in small groups, each group covering the others, advancing and retreating in patterns that appeared chaotic, but were clearly coordinated. "The humans took the position in 14 hours, Zethkar said quietly. "Total casualties: 37 wounded, 9 killed in action." Silence filled the lecture hall. Several cadets looked around at each other, as if trying to confirm they had heard correctly. Velnara's scales had shifted to a deeper blue, indicating intense concentration. "How?" she asked simply. Zethkar manipulated the display to show a detailed breakdown of the engagement. The humans didn't fight the battle the hegemony had prepared for. Instead of a frontal assault or a siege, they did something that our tactical computers still can't properly model. They turned the engagement into multiple smaller conflicts, each designed to exploit specific psychological and tactical weaknesses in the enemy defense. The display showed the human advance broken down into phases. In the first phase, small teams had infiltrated the outer perimeter not to gather intelligence, but to create confusion. They hadn't tried to disable defenses or eliminate sentries. Instead, they had moved through the defensive positions, allowing themselves to be detected, but in ways that made it impossible for the defenders to get accurate counts or positions. By the time the main assault began, Zethkar explained, the hegemony defenders were already reporting conflicting information about human positions and numbers. Some thought they were facing a full division. Others thought it was a reconnaissance probe. The humans used this confusion to make the defenders defeat themselves. Cadet Mrix's wings had stopped fluttering entirely. "They made the enemy paranoid?" "More than that," Zethkar replied. "They weaponized the enemy's own decision-making process. When the hegemony couldn't get clear information about what they were facing, they began making defensive decisions based on assumptions rather than facts. The humans anticipated these decisions and positioned themselves to exploit them." The tactical breakdown continued, showing how human Marines had used everything from fake radio chatter to controlled demolitions designed not to destroy enemy positions, but to force the defenders to redeploy their forces in predictable ways. Each phase of the assault had been designed not just to achieve a tactical objective, but to set up the conditions for the next phase. "But sir," Threx said, his voice rumbling like distant thunder, "this level of coordination requires incredible training and discipline. How do humans achieve this kind of unit cohesion?" Zethkar's color shifted again, this time to a deeper shade that his students had learned to associate with profound discomfort. That brings us to another aspect of human military culture that most species find difficult to understand. Humans don't just train their soldiers to follow orders efficiently, they train them to function independently while maintaining group objectives. The display shifted to show training footage from a human marine facility. The cadets watched as human soldiers moved through complex scenarios that seemed designed to be impossible to complete successfully. But rather than failing, the Marines adapted their tactics in real time, creating solutions that the scenarios hadn't been designed to accommodate. Most species train their military units to execute predetermined tactics effectively, Zethkar explained. Humans train their units to create new tactics spontaneously. Every human Marine is trained not just as a soldier, but as a tactical analyst, a logistical coordinator, and a battlefield commander. Velnara leaned forward in her seat. That seems incredibly inefficient, sir. How can you maintain command structure if every soldier thinks they're a commander? That's exactly what every other species asks, Zethkar replied. And it would be inefficient if humans thought about command structure the way we do. But they don't. Human command structure isn't about controlling subordinates. It's about coordinating independent operators who share common objectives. The training footage showed human Marines working in small teams, each team member taking turns as leader depending on the situation. When they encountered obstacles, leadership shifted fluidly to whoever had the most relevant expertise or the best position to assess the situation. This creates a kind of military unit that most species find almost impossible to fight effectively, Zethkar continued. When you eliminate a human commander, the unit doesn't become confused or paralyzed. It immediately reorganizes itself around a new command structure. When you force them into an unfavorable tactical situation, they don't try to withdraw or call for reinforcement. They change the nature of the engagement. The lecture hall had become completely quiet. Even species that were naturally fidgety had stopped moving as they absorbed the implications of what they were hearing. Cadet Yex, a tall, thin Meridian, whose large eyes gave him a perpetually surprised expression, raised one elongated arm. Sir, you still haven't told us the elimination rate. Zethkar looked at his datapad one more time, then back at his students. Before I give you that number, I want you to understand that it's been verified by multiple independent sources. It's not propaganda, and it's not an error in the data. He manipulated the holographic display to bring up the elimination rate chart they had been studying. The familiar numbers appeared. Kree at 2.3, Draconians at 3.1, Altarian Commandos at 4.7. The average elimination rate for a human Marine, Zethkar said slowly, across all documented engagements since they joined the Council, is 23.7 eliminations per soldier per engagement. The silence that followed was so complete that the hum of the lecture hall's environmental systems seemed loud by comparison. Several cadets looked around as if checking to see if others had heard the same number. Velnara was the first to find her voice. Sir, that can't be correct. That number is impossible by the standards of every other species, Zethkar finished. Yes. That's what every military analyst said when the data first came in. We've spent the better part of a decade trying to explain it. Cadet Threx's rocky exterior was shifting colors now, a sign of extreme agitation among his people. Sir, with respect, that number suggests that humans are not just superior soldiers, but superior by an order of magnitude that defies explanation. Either the data is wrong, or humans approach warfare in a way that makes our traditional metrics meaningless, Zethkar said. Which brings us to the real question that your classmate has raised. It's not just about elimination rates. It's about what those rates tell us about the nature of human military thinking. The holographic display shifted again. This time, showing a comparative analysis of different species' approaches to military problem solving. Charts and graphs filled the air, showing decision trees, tactical preferences, and strategic thinking patterns. Every other species in the Council approaches military problems as optimization exercises, Zethkar explained. We seek to maximize our advantages while minimizing our vulnerabilities. We try to fight battles under conditions that favor our strengths and avoid our weaknesses. The display highlighted human tactical decision-making patterns, which looked completely different from every other species. Where other militaries showed clear preference trees and predictable strategic choices, human patterns appeared almost random. Humans don't optimize for favorable conditions, Zethkar continued. They optimize for adaptability. They train specifically to fight under the worst possible conditions, against superior enemies, with inadequate resources, and then, when they encounter normal tactical situations, they have capabilities that other species can't match because they've prepared for scenarios that other species would consider hopeless. The implications were starting to sink in for the cadets. Several species were known for their tactical brilliance, others for their technological superiority, still others for their physical prowess. But humans seemed to have developed a form of military thinking that made conventional advantages irrelevant. "Sir," Rick said, her voice barely audible, "if humans are this effective in combat, why haven't they conquered the galaxy?" Zethkar's expression shifted to something that might have been relief. "Because, cadet, humans are equally unusual in their approach to politics and diplomacy. They seem to have no interest in conquest for its own sake. They fight with incredible effectiveness when they believe the cause is justified, but they show no inclination to use their military capabilities for territorial expansion or resource acquisition." "That's almost more frightening," Threx muttered. "Perhaps," Zethkar agreed. "But it's also why they were accepted into the Council so readily. Despite their obvious military advantages, a species that can fight like humans do, but chooses not to unless provoked, is exactly the kind of ally that other species want to have." Velnara raised her hand again. "Sir, you mentioned that this information isn't classified, but you seemed reluctant to discuss it. Why?" Zethkar was quiet for a long moment, his crystalline skin cycling through several different hues. "Because, cadet, once you truly understand what humans are capable of in combat, it changes how you think about everything else. It raises questions about human nature that most species find deeply unsettling." The class period was nearly over, but none of the cadets seemed to be paying attention to the time. They were all focused intently on their instructor, waiting for him to explain what he meant. "We'll continue this discussion in our next session," Zethkar said finally. "But I want you to spend some time thinking about what you've learned today. Research human conflicts. Read the tactical analyses. Examine the data. But also think about the implications." As the cadets began to file out of the lecture hall, Velnara approached the podium. "Sir, what implications specifically should we be considering?" Zethkar looked at the young Ashari cadet, seeing in her the same curiosity that had driven his own military career. "Consider this, cadet. If humans can achieve these elimination rates routinely, what does that tell us about human psychology? What kind of species develops military capabilities that far exceed any conceivable need for self-defense?" Velnara's scales shifted to a thoughtful purple. "You think they're naturally aggressive, sir?" "Quite the opposite," Zethkar replied. "Every analysis suggests that humans are naturally collaborative and peaceful, but they've developed military capabilities that suggest they've faced threats that required this level of effectiveness to survive. The question is, what kind of threats? And are those threats something the rest of the galaxy needs to worry about?" As Velnara left the lecture hall, she was already planning her research for the next class. She had no idea that her simple question had started a chain of inquiry that would fundamentally change how the Galactic Council viewed both human capabilities and the universe they all shared. 3 days later, Velnara sat in the Academy's central archives, surrounded by datapads, holographic displays, and printouts that covered every surface of her study alcove. She had barely slept since Commander Zethkar's revelation about human elimination rates, and the more she researched, the more questions arose. The data was consistent across every source she could find. Human Marines didn't just achieve high elimination rates. They achieved them under conditions that would cause other species to retreat or request massive reinforcements. More disturbing was the pattern she was beginning to see in human tactical decisions. Still digging into human military records? Velnara looked up to see Cadet Threx approaching, his massive frame causing the floor to vibrate slightly with each step. Behind him came Rix, her delicate wings catching the archive's artificial lighting. "I can't stop," Velnara admitted. "The more I read, the less sense it makes. Look at this." She gestured to a holographic display showing the Battle of Kepler Station. Standard tactical analysis said the station was indefensible. 3 separate species had tried to hold it against hegemony forces and failed. The humans not only defended it, they used it as a base to launch counterattacks. Threx studied the tactical breakdown with his people's characteristic patience. "The defensive positions do seem inadequate," he agreed. "But humans are known for their engineering capabilities. Perhaps they modified the station's defenses?" "That's what I thought too," Velnara replied, calling up another set of data. "But look at the timeline. The humans had less than 6 hours between their arrival and the first hegemony assault. They couldn't have made significant structural modifications." Mrix fluttered closer to examine the data. "Then how did they turn an indefensible position into a fortress?" "They didn't," Velnara said quietly. "They turned it into a trap." The 3 cadets spent the next hour going through the tactical records together. What emerged was a picture of human strategic thinking that defied conventional military wisdom. Instead of trying to make Kepler Station defensible, the human Marines had used its vulnerabilities as tactical advantages. They let the hegemony forces establish siege positions, Velnara explained, highlighting the enemy deployment patterns. Every other species tried to prevent the hegemony from getting close to the station. The humans actively encouraged it. 1. The tactical map showed hegemony forces moving into what appeared to be ideal siege positions around the station. But the human records revealed that each of these positions had been anticipated and prepared for. When the siege began, the hegemony found themselves trapped in kill zones that had been carefully constructed around their own tactical preferences. "This is insane," Threx muttered. "They're using the enemy's tactical doctrine against them. But how could they predict hegemony movements so accurately?" Velnara called up another file. "That's where it gets really interesting. Look at this intelligence report from before the battle." The report detailed human intelligence gathering activities in the weeks leading up to the Battle of Kepler Station. But unlike conventional reconnaissance, which focused on enemy positions and capabilities, the humans had spent most of their efforts studying hegemony tactical decision-making patterns. "They weren't trying to learn what the hegemony could do," Mrix observed. "They were trying to learn how the hegemony thinks." "Exactly," Velnara agreed. "And then they used that psychological profile to manipulate the entire engagement. They made the hegemony choose the battle the humans wanted to fight." Threx's rocky features shifted into deep concentration. "That requires a level of psychological understanding that most species don't develop about their own people, let alone their enemies." As if summoned by their conversation, Commander Zethkar appeared at their study alcove. "Cadets, I thought I might find you here." "Sir," Velnara said, starting to stand. "We were just researching the material from your lecture." "At ease," Zethkar said, settling his large frame into a chair that creaked under his weight. "I'm not here in an official capacity. I'm here because I've been watching human military operations for 15 years, and I've never had students show this level of interest in understanding them." "Sir," Mrix said hesitantly, "the more we learn about human tactics, the more questions we have about human psychology. These aren't just effective soldiers. This is something else entirely." Zethkar nodded slowly. "What have you discovered?" Velnara gestured to the displays around them. "We've been analyzing human engagements across multiple conflicts, and we found a pattern. Humans don't just adapt to their enemies' tactics. They seem to understand their enemies' thought processes better than the enemies understand themselves." "Show me," Zethkar said. The cadets spent the next 20 minutes walking their instructor through their research. They showed him the psychological profiles humans had developed of different enemy species, the ways human tactics exploited not just tactical weaknesses but cognitive biases, and the consistent pattern of humans using their enemies' strengths as vulnerabilities. "Most species develop tactics to counter enemy capabilities," Velnara explained. "Humans develop tactics to manipulate enemy decision-making. It's like they're not just fighting the other side's military forces, they're fighting the other side's minds." Zethkar was quiet for a long time after the cadets finished their presentation. His crystalline skin cycled through several colors as he processed what they had shown him. "There's something I haven't told you about human military culture," he said finally. "Something that most species find so disturbing that it's rarely discussed in official analyses." The three cadets leaned forward, sensing that they were about to learn something significant. "Humans don't just train their soldiers to fight," Zethkar continued. "They train them to survive. But not just physical survival. Psychological survival. Cultural survival. They prepare their military forces for scenarios that most species can't even conceptualize." "What kind of scenarios?" Threx asked. Zethkar called up a new display, showing human military training programs. Humans train their soldiers for what they call extinction-level conflicts. Wars where losing doesn't just mean defeat, but the complete destruction of their species. The training programs shown on the display were unlike anything the cadets had seen from other species. Where most militaries focused on conventional tactics and standard scenarios, human training included psychological conditioning for hopeless situations, tactical instruction for fighting with no logistical support, and strategic planning for conflicts where the enemy possessed overwhelming advantages. They train every Marine to fight as if the survival of their entire species depends on their individual performance, Zethkar explained. This creates soldiers who don't just follow orders or execute tactics. It creates soldiers who take personal responsibility for impossible victories. Mrix's wings had stopped moving entirely. "Sir, that kind of psychological conditioning could be extremely damaging to individuals." "You would think so," Zethkar agreed. "But humans seem to thrive under this kind of pressure. In fact, they appear to function better in high-stress, high-stakes situations than they do in routine circumstances." Velnara was studying the training data with intense concentration. "Sir, this explains the elimination rates. But it raises another question. If humans are conditioned to fight extinction-level conflicts, how do they function in normal military operations? That's perhaps the most remarkable aspect of human military psychology." Zethkar replied. "They scale their intensity to match the situation, but they never scale down their level of preparation or tactical sophistication. Every engagement, no matter how small, receives the same level of strategic analysis and tactical planning that they would apply to a species-level threat." The implications were staggering. The cadets were beginning to understand that they hadn't been studying conventional military tactics at all. They had been studying a form of warfare that was designed around the assumption that losing was not an option under any circumstances. "Sir," Threx said slowly, "if humans approach every conflict as if it's an extinction-level threat, how do they distinguish between situations that actually require this level of response and situations that don't?" Zethkar's expression became deeply serious. "That's the question that keeps galactic military analysts awake at night, Cadet. Because the evidence suggests that humans don't distinguish between these situations. They approach every conflict with the same psychological intensity and tactical sophistication." The archive around them had grown quiet as other students left for the evening, but the four remained focused on their discussion. The data they had uncovered painted a picture of human military culture that was both inspiring and deeply unsettling. "There's one more thing you need to understand," Zethkar said, calling up a final set of data. "Human elimination rates aren't just high because of their tactical skills or psychological conditioning. They're high because humans have developed a form of warfare that other species literally cannot comprehend." The display showed comparative analyses of human tactics versus conventional military doctrine. Where other species sought to minimize casualties, control territory, or destroy enemy capabilities, human tactics seem designed to achieve something else entirely. "Humans don't fight to win battles," Zethkar explained. "They fight to end conflicts. Every engagement is designed not just to achieve immediate tactical objectives, but to create psychological and strategic conditions that make continued resistance unthinkable for their enemies." Velnara stared at the data, beginning to understand the full scope of what they had discovered. "They're not just eliminating enemy soldiers, sir. They're eliminating the enemy's will to continue fighting." "Precisely," Zethkar confirmed. "And they do this not through brutality or overwhelming force, but through tactical and psychological precision that convinces their enemies that resistance is futile. It's a form of warfare that achieves complete victory through the application of surgical violence, rather than massive destruction. The three cadets looked at each other, each trying to process the implications of what they had learned. They had started their research trying to understand high elimination rates. What they had discovered was a species that had developed military capabilities beyond anything in the known galaxy. "Sir," Rick said quietly, "if humans can end conflicts this decisively, why isn't every species trying to learn from them?" Zethkar's color shifted to something the cadets had never seen before. A deep blue-green that seemed to suggest profound unease. "Because, cadet, most species find human military thinking fundamentally incomprehensible. We can study their tactics, analyze their strategies, even copy their techniques, but we can't replicate the psychological framework that makes those techniques effective." "What do you mean?" Threx asked. "Human military effectiveness isn't just about training or technology or even tactical innovation," Zethkar explained. "It's about a species-wide psychological characteristic that allows them to function effectively under conditions that would break the minds of other species. They can maintain rational thought processes and tactical coordination while accepting casualty rates and psychological stress levels that would cause other militaries to collapse." The cadets absorbed this information in silence. They were beginning to understand that their research had uncovered something far more significant than unusual military tactics. They had discovered evidence of a species that was psychologically adapted for a form of warfare that other species could barely imagine. "Sir," Velnara said finally, "what does this mean for the rest of the galaxy? If humans have these capabilities, what happens if they ever decide to use them aggressively?" Zethkar looked at his students, seeing in their expressions the same concern that had driven his own sleepless nights for the past 15 years. "That, cadets, is why your research is so important. Understanding human military capabilities isn't just an academic exercise. It's critical intelligence that could determine the future of every species in the galaxy. And based on what you've discovered, I think it's time to dig deeper into the question that really matters." "Which question is that, sir?" Mrix asked. Zethkar's expression became grimly determined. "We need to understand what made humans develop these capabilities in the first place. Because species don't evolve military thinking this sophisticated unless they've faced threats that required it for survival." "You think there's something else out there?" Velnara asked quietly. "I think," Zethkar replied, "that humans have been preparing for a war that the rest of the galaxy doesn't even know is coming." 2 weeks had passed since their midnight conversation in the archives, and the small research group had grown. Word of their discoveries had spread quietly through the academy. And now nearly 20 cadets from a dozen different species gathered regularly to pool their research efforts. They had also gained an unexpected ally. Professor Keth Moore, the Academy's senior xenopsychology instructor, whose expertise in interspecies psychology had proven invaluable in understanding human military thinking. The group met in Conference Room 7, which had been unofficially designated for their use after Professor Keth Moore submitted a formal research proposal to the Academy administration. The walls were covered with holographic displays, showing everything from human tactical manuals to psychological profiles to historical analyses of conflicts spanning hundreds of worlds. "I think we've been approaching this wrong," announced Cadet Yex, the tall Meridian whose large eyes seemed to take in every detail of the displays around them. "We've been trying to understand human military capabilities by analyzing their tactics and training. But what if the key isn't what they do, but why they do it?" Velnara looked up from the datapad she'd been studying. "What do you mean?" Yex manipulated one of the holographic displays to show a timeline of human history. "Look at this pattern. Humans don't just fight when they're attacked. They fight when they perceive threats that might become attacks. They don't just defend their territory. They defend concepts, ideas, ways of life that other species barely understand." The timeline showed human conflicts stretching back thousands of years, from ancient tribal warfare to interplanetary battles. But unlike other species' military histories, which showed clear patterns of territorial expansion and resource competition, human conflicts seemed to be driven by abstract concepts that were difficult for other species to comprehend. Professor Keth Moore, whose insectoid features gave him an perpetually thoughtful expression, clicked his mandibles thoughtfully. Cadet Yex raises an interesting point. Human military psychology appears to be driven by threats that other species would not even recognize as threats. Commander Zethkar, who had become a regular participant in these sessions, accessed his own data files. We've been focusing on human tactical capabilities, but perhaps we should examine human strategic objectives. What do humans actually fight for? The group spent the next hour going through human military conflicts, trying to identify common strategic objectives. What emerged was a pattern that none of them had expected. They don't fight for territory, observed Cadet Threx, his rocky features showing deep concentration. Even when they conquer territory, they usually give it back. They don't fight for resources, added Mrix, her delicate wings reflecting the holographic light. They often spend more resources winning a conflict than they could possibly gain from victory, and they don't fight for glory or honor in any way that other species would recognize, Velnara continued. Their military culture seems to actively discourage individual recognition or species-level pride. Professor Kethmore manipulated the display to highlight human post-conflict behavior. Look at what humans do after they win military victories. They rebuild their enemy's infrastructure, provide medical aid, establish educational systems, and often leave the defeated species in a better position than they were before the conflict began. The implications were staggering. The group was looking at evidence of a species that had developed the most effective military in the known galaxy, but used it in ways that seemed to contradict every known motivation for military action. So what do they fight for? Yex asked quietly. The answer came from an unexpected source. Cadet Nexus, a young Valerian who had joined the group only recently, had been quietly analyzing human communications intercepts from various conflicts. I think they fight for other people, he said, his tentacles moving in patterns that indicated certainty among his species. What do you mean? Zethkar asked. Nexus brought up a new display showing communication logs from human military units during the rescue of Altair Prime. Look at the patterns in human military communications. They don't talk about victory conditions or strategic objectives. They talk about people they're trying to save, protect, or help. The communication logs showed human Marines discussing their missions in terms that were completely different from other military forces. Instead of focusing on tactical objectives or strategic advantages, human soldiers seemed primarily concerned with the welfare of non-combatants, allied forces, and sometimes even their enemies. During the siege of Kepler Station, Nexus continued, human forces spent significant resources providing medical aid to wounded hegemony soldiers. During the Battle of Rigel 7th, they diverted tactical resources to evacuate civilian populations that weren't even allied with human forces. Professor Kethmore's mandibles clicked more rapidly, a sign of intense thought among his people. This suggests that human military psychology is driven not by traditional, competitive, or territorial impulses, but by what we might call protective instincts extended beyond their own species. The group absorbed this idea in silence. They were looking at evidence that humans had developed unprecedented military capabilities not to dominate other species, but to protect them. But that doesn't explain the psychological conditioning for extinction-level conflicts, Velnara pointed out. If humans are naturally protective, why do they train for scenarios where survival is impossible? It was Commander Zethkar who provided the answer, his crystalline skin shifting to colors that indicated he was accessing deep memory files. Because they're not training to survive extinction-level conflicts, they're training to prevent them. The room fell silent as the implications of this statement sank in. Zethkar continued, his voice carrying a weight that made even the largest cadets lean forward. I've been reviewing classified intelligence files that I wasn't supposed to have access to, he admitted. Files about human origins and the conditions on their home world that shaped their military thinking. 53. Sir, Velnara said carefully. Should we be hearing this? Yes, Zethkar replied firmly. Because what I've learned changes everything we thought we knew about humans and their place in the galaxy. He activated a new holographic display that showed Earth's solar system, but with details that most of the cadets had never seen before. The display highlighted not just the planets, but the debris fields, asteroid impact sites, and other evidence of cosmic violence. Earth is located in what galactic astronomers call a impact zone, Zethkar explained. The frequency of asteroid impacts, solar flare activity, and other cosmic threats in their system is approximately 40 times higher than the galactic average. The display zoomed in on Earth itself, showing geological evidence of massive impact events, volcanic catastrophes, and climate disruptions that had occurred throughout the planet's history. Humans evolved under conditions where extinction-level events weren't theoretical possibilities, Zethkar continued. They were regular occurrences. Species-level survival wasn't just a military doctrine for humans. It was a basic survival skill that they developed before they even achieved consciousness. Professor Kethmore's entire body had gone still, a sign of extreme concentration among his people. That would explain their psychological adaptations for impossible stress levels. They're not abnormal by human standards. They're normal for a species that had to develop the ability to function effectively under existential threat. But sir, Threk said slowly, if humans evolved under these conditions, why are they so concerned with protecting other species? Wouldn't survival pressure make them more aggressive, not more protective? Zethkar manipulated the display to show human evolutionary history in greater detail. That's where human psychology becomes truly unique. Instead of becoming more aggressive under survival pressure, they became more cooperative. They developed the ability to function as a unified species under threat conditions. The display showed evidence of early human societies working together to survive natural disasters, climate changes, and cosmic events that would have destroyed most species. But more remarkably, it showed humans extending this cooperation to other species they encountered. Humans didn't just learn to survive extinction-level events, Zethkar explained. They learned to help others survive them too. Their entire military culture is based on the assumption that if one species faces an existential threat, all species are potentially threatened. Velnara stared at the data, beginning to understand the full scope of what they had discovered. Sir, are you saying that humans developed their military capabilities to protect the galaxy from threats that other species don't even know exist? I'm saying, Zethkar replied, that humans are the only species in the known galaxy that has experience surviving the kind of cosmic-scale threats that could destroy entire civilizations. And they've spent their entire military development preparing to help other species survive those same threats. The implications were overwhelming. The group had started by trying to understand human elimination rates. What they had discovered was that humans were not just unusually effective soldiers, but representatives of a species that had been shaped by cosmic forces to serve as protectors for other forms of life. That explains everything, Nexus said quietly. The tactical sophistication, the psychological conditioning, the protective instincts. Humans aren't just good at warfare, they're good at preventing extinction. Professor Kethmore activated his own datapad and began accessing classified files. If Commander Zethkar is correct, then human military capabilities aren't just impressive by current galactic standards. They're specifically designed to address threats that current galactic civilization has never encountered. What kind of threats? Mrix asked, though her tone suggested she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Zethkar brought up one final display, showing astronomical data from the edges of known space. The kind of threats that destroyed the precursor civilizations. The kind of threats that created the dead zones we've found throughout the galaxy. The kind of threats that humans have been preparing for their entire evolutionary history. The display showed evidence of massive cosmic events in the galaxy's past. Civilizations that had vanished completely, and astronomical phenomena that suggested forces beyond anything current galactic science could explain. Humans know something that the rest of us don't, Zethkar said quietly. They know that the universe is far more dangerous than we've realized, and they've been preparing for threats that we can't even imagine. Velnara looked around the room at her fellow cadets, seeing in their expressions the same mixture of awe and terror that she felt. Sir, what does this mean for the rest of us? It means, Zethkar replied, that humans didn't join the Galactic Council to benefit from our protection. They joined to protect us from threats we don't even know are coming. The room was silent for a long time as the group processed this revelation. They had uncovered the truth behind human military capabilities, but in doing so, they had learned something far more significant about the universe they all shared. "There's one more thing," Commander Zethkar said finally. "Something that changes everything we thought we knew about galactic security." He activated a final display showing current astronomical data from the galaxy's outer rim. 3 months ago, deep space monitoring stations began detecting unusual energy patterns at the edge of our galaxy, patterns that match some of the phenomena associated with the cosmic events that destroyed previous civilizations. The display showed energy signatures and gravitational anomalies that were unlike anything in current scientific databases. But superimposed over this data were human military deployment patterns that showed a clear correlation. "Human forces have been quietly repositioning throughout the galaxy," Zethkar explained. "Not for conquest or territorial expansion, but to establish defensive positions against threats from outside our galaxy. They've been preparing for something that our best scientists say is impossible. And they've been doing it without telling anyone, because they knew we wouldn't believe them." The implications hit the cadets like a physical force. Everything they had learned about human military capabilities suddenly made sense in a context that was both terrifying and reassuring. "So, when someone asks about the elimination rate of a human marine," Velnara said slowly, "the real answer isn't a number. It's that humans don't fight battles the way other species do. They fight wars that other species can't even conceptualize, against enemies that other species don't know exist, to protect civilizations that don't even realize they need protection." "Exactly," Zethkar confirmed. "And that, cadets, is why the Academy needs to completely restructure its approach to military science. Because we're not just studying different tactics or weapon systems, we're studying a species that has been shaped by cosmic forces to serve as guardians for the entire galaxy." As the group finally dispersed, each cadet carrying datapads full of research that would change their understanding of military science forever, Velnara remained behind with Commander Zethkar. "Sir," she said quietly. "What happens now?" Zethkar looked out through the conference room's viewing port at the stars beyond. "Now, cadet, we prepare. Because if humans are right about what's coming, then every species in this galaxy is going to need to learn how to fight like a human marine. And based on what you've discovered, that might be the only thing that saves us all." In the distance, almost beyond the range of the Academy's sensors, human ships moved through space with purpose and precision that suddenly made perfect sense. They weren't patrolling territory or protecting trade routes. They were standing guard against the darkness between galaxies, preparing to face threats that other species couldn't imagine, ready to fight a war for the survival of every living thing in the galaxy. And somewhere in the depths of space, energy patterns that had destroyed countless civilizations before began to move toward the Milky Way, unaware that this time, they would face defenders who had spent their entire evolutionary history learning how to survive the impossible.